In the spring of 1856, when the Wyoming Territory was still nothing more than open grass and hard sky, a wagon driver found a baby girl wrapped in a feed sack on the porch of the Cedar Hollow trading post, and no one in 3 counties ever came forward to claim her. The trading post sat at the crossing of 2 wagon ruts that would one day become roads, and the man who found her, a peddler named Otis Grimm, carried the infant inside wrapped against his coat because the March wind still had teeth in it. The women of Cedar Hollow gathered around the counter and clucked over the child, but none of them reached to take her home, for there was not a family in that hard, thin country that could spare another mouth. So the baby was given to the Territorial Orphan Asylum in the town of Prairie Bend, a low stone building with narrow windows that looked more like a jail than a home for children, and the matron there wrote in her ledger, in a plain, tired hand, the name Lucy, because it had been her own mother's name, and Hadley, because that was the name stitched crookedly into the corner of the feed sack she had been found in. Nobody knew if Hadley was truly her family's name or simply the name of whoever had once owned that sack of grain. It did not matter. It was the only name she would ever have, and she wore it the way a person wears a scar, with a kind of stubborn pride that came later, once she was old enough to understand what had been done to her. The asylum was not a cruel place in the way that stories sometimes tell it, not full of monsters, but it was a hard place, and hard places make hard children if those children are not careful, or they break them instead. Lucy Hadley grew up learning to mend her own stockings by the age of 6, to scrub floors on her knees until her knuckles bled, to eat quickly before an older child could steal her portion, and to never, ever cry where the matron could see her, because tears were treated like a sickness that had to be stamped out early. She was passed from the asylum to a farm family near Laramie when she was 7, to work for her keep rather than to be loved, and when that family's crops failed 2 years later, she was sent back to Prairie Bend like a piece of unwanted furniture returned to a store. She learned, in those years, the particular ache of being looked over. She would stand in the yard when visiting families came searching for a strong boy to work their land or a small, pretty girl to raise as their own, and she would watch families walk right past her, because she was neither small nor especially pretty, only tall for her age and quiet in a way that unsettled people who wanted an easy child. It was Thomas Doyle who finally saw something in her that others had not troubled themselves to look for. He and his wife Abigail owned a modest cattle operation 20 miles west of Prairie Bend, along a slow green river that the local Shoshone people had called by a name that meant something like Singing Water, though the settlers had shortened it simply to Singing Creek. Thomas was 61 years old in the autumn of 1863, when he came to the asylum looking for a hand who could help with the herding now that his own sons had gone east to fight in the war and had not, either of them, come home. He was told there was a girl, 9 years old, too tall and too quiet, and he was warned that she was known to talk back. "Bring her out," Thomas said. "I like a girl who talks back." "Means she has got something left in her." Lucy remembered all her life the way Thomas Doyle had knelt down in the asylum yard, an old man with a white mustache and hands like cracked leather, and looked her straight in the eye instead of over her head the way most adults did. "You know anything about cattle, girl?" he had asked her. "No, sir," she had answered. "Good," he had said. "Neither did I once. We will learn it together." Abigail Doyle, when Lucy arrived at Singing Creek Ranch with nothing but a small bundle of clothes and a Bible she had never been taught to read, took one look at the thin, wary child and set about feeding her until her cheeks filled out, and it was Abigail who finally taught her the letters and numbers that the asylum had never bothered with. Lucy Hadley spent the next 11 years of her life on that ranch, learning to ride before she was steady on her own 2 feet, learning to rope a calf, to doctor a sick horse, to read the sky for weather the way her adopted father could, to keep books and count cattle, and understand the value of land and water in a country where both were scarcer than gold. She was not their daughter by blood or by law, for Thomas Doyle, in the stubborn way of men of that country, kept putting off the paperwork that would have made the adoption formal, always saying there would be time enough for that later. But she was their daughter in every way that mattered, and by the time she was 18 years old, in the spring of 1874, she could run that ranch as well as any man in the valley, and better than most. Then the influenza came through Wyoming Territory in the winter of 1873, and it took Abigail first, quick and cruel in the space of 11 days, and it took what remained of Thomas Doyle's heart along with her. He lingered through the winter, thinner each week, and in March, with the snow still thick on the high ridges, he called Lucy to his bedside. "I never did the paperwork," he told her, his voice thin as paper itself. "I am sorry for that girl. I always meant to make you a Doyle proper, but I have made you something better instead. I have made you a rancher. There is a will in the strongbox under the floor of the tack room. Everything is yours. Every acre, every head of cattle, every dollar we managed to save. It is not much of a ranch, not yet, but it is honest ground, and it is yours free and clear, and no man in this territory can take it from you so long as you hold onto that paper and never let go of it." He died 3 days later, and Lucy Hadley buried him beside Abigail on the low hill above Singing Creek, under a cottonwood tree that had been there longer than any white settler in the valley, and she stood alone at that grave in a black dress that had been Abigail's, 24,000 acres of grazing land legally hers, and not one living soul left in the world who shared her blood or her name by right. The valley they called Cedar Hollow Valley in those days had grown into a proper stretch of ranching country by 1874, with the town of Prairie Bend swelling to nearly 400 souls, a bank, 2 churches, a land office, and a saloon that did more business on a Saturday night than the churches did on a Sunday morning. And in that valley, there was one man who owned more land than anyone else, a hard, ambitious cattle baron named Jedediah Crow, who had come out from Missouri in the years just after the war with enough capital to buy up half the failing homesteads in the county, and who had his eye, as it happened, on the water rights that ran along Singing Creek, rights that belonged now to a 19-year-old orphan girl with no husband, no father, and no one in the territory to speak for her. Crow came calling within a month of Thomas Doyle's funeral, dressed in a black suit far too fine for a cattle ranch, riding a horse far too clean for honest work, and he sat in Lucy's own kitchen at her own table and told her in a voice that dripped with false kindness that a young woman alone had no business trying to hold onto a spread as large as Singing Creek. "I will give you a fair price," he said, setting his hat on the table as though he already owned the house it sat in. "More than fair. Enough to set you up comfortable in town. A girl your age ought to be thinking of a husband and a house with a garden, not fighting drought and rustlers and bank notes. This is my land, Mr. Crow," Lucy said, and she did not raise her voice, because Thomas Doyle had taught her that a raised voice was often the sound of a losing argument. "Thomas and Abigail Doyle left it to me legal and proper, and I intend to keep it. A piece of paper is only as strong as the men willing to enforce it," Crow said, smiling with teeth that were too white and too even. "And out here, Miss Hadley, there are not many men willing to stand behind a paper that favors an orphan girl over a man who sits on the county land board." It was not quite a threat, not in words a lawyer could pin down, but Lucy understood it for exactly what it was, and she showed Jedediah Crow to the door with a politeness that cost her more effort than she let him see, and she latched it behind him, and then she sat down at her kitchen table and allowed herself, for the first time since Thomas Doyle's funeral, to cry. She did not cry for long. Crying, she had learned in the asylum, was a luxury that did not fill a stomach or pay a debt, and there was a ranch to run and cattle to feed, and a drought that summer that turned the grass along Singing Creek the color of old straw by the middle of July. Lucy hired what hands she could afford, which was not many, for word had traveled through the bunkhouses of the valley that Singing Creek was a woman's outfit now, and there were men who would not work for a woman on principle, and other men who assumed a woman alone could be cheated of wages easily enough that it was not worth the trouble of honest labor. She was down to 2 hired men by August, both of them past 60 and glad of the light work she gave them, when she rode into Prairie Bend one blistering afternoon and found a stranger standing outside the livery stable with a saddle over one shoulder and the particular stillness of a man who has nowhere in the world he is expected to be. His name, she would soon learn, was Wesley Wilcox, and he was 23 years old, and he had ridden into the valley 3 days earlier from somewhere down in the Colorado Territory, following the last of the summer cattle drives north before the herd scattered for the winter. He was not a large man, not in the way some cowboys were built like barn doors, but he had a leanness to him that spoke of hard use and little rest, sun-browned skin, a scar along his left eyebrow that he had gotten, as she would learn much later, from a rope that had snapped during a branding when he was 16, and eyes the color of good strong coffee, steady and watchful in a way that made a person feel, oddly, that they had been truly seen for the first time in a long while. "You looking for work?" Lucy asked him, because she had learned, in 19 years of being overlooked and underestimated, not to waste time on pleasantries when there was business to be done. Wesley Wilcox looked her over, not the way Jedediah Crow had looked her over, sizing up a piece of property, but the way a man looks over a stranger he is deciding whether or not to trust. "Depends on the work," he said. "Cattle work, real work, fair wages, though I will tell you straight I cannot pay what the big outfits pay, not this year with the drought as bad as it has been." "You the owner?" "I am." He was quiet a moment, and Lucy braced herself for the same tired argument she had heard a dozen times that summer, that a ranch was no place for a woman to be giving orders, that he would rather work for a man. But Wesley Wilcox only nodded slowly, as though he had turned the matter over in his mind and found no particular objection in it. "I have worked for worse reasons than a fair wage and honest work," he said. "I will take the job, ma'am, if you will have me." "Lucy," she said. "Lucy Hadley. Ma'am makes me feel a good deal older than I am." "Wesley Wilcox," he said, and something in the corner of his mouth turned up, not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Hadley." She hired him that same afternoon, and within a week she understood that she had found, in this quiet, drifting cowboy, a hand worth 3 of any man she had employed before him. He worked from before sunrise until well after the supper hour without complaint. He had a gift for gentling wild horses that bordered on the uncanny, and he treated the 2 old hired men with a respect that made them work harder for him than they had for anyone in years. He did not talk much, not at first, but Lucy found she did not mind the quiet, for it was the kind of quiet that did not press or demand, the kind that simply sat easy beside her while they rode the fence lines together in the long gold evenings of that dry summer. It was during one of those evenings, in early September, that Wesley told her, without her having asked, why a man his age was drifting alone through the territory with no family and no home to speak of. "I was raised in an orphan home myself," he said, as they sat their horses on a ridge above Singing Creek, watching the sun drop toward the Wind River Mountains in the west. "Down in Missouri. My mother died having me, and my father, I am told, could not stand the sight of me after, on account of I looked too much like her. He left me at the church steps when I was 3 days old, and nobody ever saw him again." Lucy turned in her saddle to look at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "I was left on a trading post porch," she said finally, "wrapped in a feed sack. Nobody ever came looking for me either." Wesley met her eyes, and there was no pity in his look, only a kind of recognition, the particular understanding that passes between 2 people who have both learned, young, what it is to be unwanted. "Then I suppose we are neither of us strangers to being overlooked," he said quietly. "No," Lucy said, "I suppose we are not." It was a small conversation. only a handful of sentences traded across two horses on a dusty ridge. But it planted something between them that grew steadily through the weeks that followed. A kinship that had nothing to do with romance at first, and everything to do with the plain fact of being understood by another soul who had walked a similar road. Lucy found herself, without quite deciding to, looking forward to the moments in each day when Wesley Wilcox would ride in from the far pastures and give his brief, dry report on the herd, and Wesley found himself lingering a little longer over supper than the work strictly required, listening to Lucy talk about her plans for the ranch, the fences she meant to mend, the better breed of cattle she hoped to buy once the drought broke and the bank note was paid down. The drought did not break easily. By October, the creek had shrunk to half its normal width, and Lucy watched her herd grow thinner and her savings grow thinner alongside them. And it was in this lean season that Jedediah Crow made his move, not through an offer this time, but through a rumor, carefully planted in the saloon and the general store, that Singing Creek Ranch was drying up its own water to spite the smaller outfits downstream. A lie so brazen that Lucy could hardly believe it when she first heard it repeated back to her by the storekeeper's wife. "That is a filthy lie," Lucy said to Wesley that evening, pacing the length of her own kitchen with her hands balled into fists. "Crow owns half the water rights above us on the creek. If anyone is starving this valley of water, it is him, holding it back to force the small ranches to sell out cheap." "I know it," Wesley said. "Everybody with sense knows it, but rumors do not care much for sense, Lucy. They only care for repeating. Then what am I supposed to do? Sit here and let him talk my ranch into ruin?" Wesley set down the mug of coffee he had been nursing and looked at her steadily. "You go to town. You go to the land office and the bank both, and you show them your books, clean and honest, and you let the truth stand up next to Crow's lie in the daylight where folks can see the difference. A lie only wins in the dark, Lucy. Bring it into the light, and it withers same as any weed." She went the next morning, with Wesley riding beside her, and she laid her account books open on the desk of the land office clerk, showed the honest tallies of cattle and water use that Thomas Doyle had taught her to keep meticulously, and she asked, plainly and without apology, that the clerk ride out and see the creek for himself before believing idle talk from men with their own interest in seeing her fail. It was a small victory, the kind that does not make for dramatic stories, but it mattered enormously in a valley where reputation was often worth more than gold, and within 2 weeks the rumor had died back, starved of the darkness it needed to survive, exactly as Wesley had said it would. Jedediah Crow did not take the defeat gracefully. He was a man unused to being thwarted by anyone, let alone a girl not yet 20 years old, and his anger, when it came, did not come as another offer to buy her out, but as something colder and more dangerous. It began with the cattle. In the last week of October, Lucy woke before dawn to the sound of her 2 old hired men shouting from the pasture nearest the creek, and when she and Wesley rode out with rifles across their saddles, they found the north fence cut clean through in 3 places and 40 head of cattle missing, driven off in the night by men who had left boot prints and cigarette ends behind them but little else. "Rustlers," Wesley said grimly, crouching to study the tracks in the cold morning light. 3 men, maybe 4. Shod horses, good ones, not the kind of animals a poor drifter rides. "Crow's men," Lucy said, and it was not a question. "Can you prove it?" "No," she admitted. "But I know it just the same." They rode the tracks for 6 miles before losing them in a stretch of rocky ground near the county line, and Lucy returned to Singing Creek that evening 40 head of cattle poorer, and a debt payment due at the bank in less than 3 weeks, a payment she now had no realistic way of making. It was Wesley who suggested, that night, sitting across the kitchen table from her with a lamp burning low between them, the plan that would ultimately save the ranch, though it was a plan that frightened Lucy more than she liked to admit. "There is a cattle buyer coming through Prairie Bend at the end of the month," Wesley said. "Fellow named Sorensen, buying for the stockyards up in Cheyenne, paying top dollar on account of the drought driving prices up everywhere else. If we could get the rest of the herd to him before Crow finds some other way to interfere, you would have more than enough to cover the note at the bank, with some left over besides. The rest of the herd is 110 head, spread over near 20,000 acres of rough country, Lucy said. It would take a full crew 2 weeks to gather that many cattle in normal times, and I have got you and 2 men past 60. Then we had better start before sunup tomorrow, Wesley said, and we had better hope Crow does not catch wind of what we are doing until it is too late for him to stop it. They worked themselves half to exhaustion over the next 11 days, riding from dark to dark, sleeping in snatched hours beside campfires on the range rather than wasting time riding back to the house. And slowly, painstakingly, the scattered herd came together into one great restless mass of cattle held in the home pasture, counted and recounted, until Lucy was satisfied the tally was as close to whole as the rustling had left it. It was during those long, hard days, riding side by side across the dry autumn grass, that Lucy Hadley found herself falling in love with Wesley Wilcox, not in any single dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones. The way he sang low under his breath to calm a spooked calf, the way he always made certain she ate before he did at their campfire suppers, the way he never once, in all those exhausting days, complained of the work or suggested that a woman ought not be riding herd alongside her men. The moment she understood the full depth of it came on the 9th night, when a sudden autumn storm blew up out of the mountains and scattered a third of the gathered herd back across the dark range, and Wesley rode out alone into thunder and driving rain to bring them back rather than lose 2 days of work regathering them in daylight. Lucy sat by the fire for 3 hours, unable to eat, unable to do anything but watch the black horizon for some sign of him, and when he finally rode back into the firelight, soaked through and shivering, driving a dozen head of cattle ahead of him, she ran to him before he had even swung down from the saddle and wrapped her arms around him without a single word of explanation needed on either side. "I thought something had happened to you," she said into his shoulder, her voice muffled and raw. "I am hard to lose, Lucy," Wesley said, and she could hear, even exhausted as he was, the smile in his voice. "Harder than a little Wyoming thunder, anyway." "Do not do that to me again," she said, pulling back just far enough to look at him, rain still running down both their faces. "I could not bear it if something happened to you out here." He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, something that had perhaps been building since that first evening on the ridge above Singing Creek, and he reached up slowly and brushed a strand of wet hair back from her face. "I did not think there was anybody left in this world who would grieve if I did not come back from something," he said quietly. "Not since I was old enough to understand what it meant, being left the way I was left. I had made my peace with that a long time ago." "Well, you had better unmake it," Lucy said, her voice trembling now with more than cold, "because I would grieve for you something terrible, Wesley Wilcox, and I do not intend to keep that a secret from you any longer." He kissed her then, there in the rain with the fire hissing behind them and a dozen wet, exhausted cattle standing patient in the dark, and it was not a gentle first kiss, not tentative or unsure, but something fierce and certain, the kind of kiss that comes from 2 people who have each spent their whole lives being told, in ways large and small, that they were not worth claiming, finally finding someone who claimed them anyway. They finished gathering the herd in the 2 days that followed, driving 106 head of cattle into Prairie Bend, on the morning the buyer Sorensen had set for his purchasing, and Lucy stood in the stockyard beside Wesley while the cattle were weighed and counted, and the price agreed upon, a price that came to just over $4,000, more money than Lucy had ever held at one time in her life. She paid the note at the bank that same afternoon, with enough left over to repair the cut fences, replace the stolen cattle, and set aside a cushion against the winter. And when she walked out of the bank onto the dusty main street of Prairie Bend, she found Jedediah Crow standing across the street outside the saloon, watching her with an expression that had curdled from confidence into something considerably uglier. He crossed the street to meet her, and Wesley stepped up beside her without being asked, close enough that Crow's eyes flicked between them with sudden, sharp understanding. "I hear you managed to gather your herd after all," Crow said. "Remarkable, considering your troubles with rustlers." "Remarkable indeed," Lucy said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Almost as remarkable as rustlers riding shod horses too fine for drifters, cutting fence in 3 places on the same night, 6 miles from the county line where the tracks happened to disappear." Crow's jaw tightened, but he said nothing to that, only smiled his too white smile and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was mockery dressed up as courtesy. "You have had good luck this season, Miss Hadley," he said. "Luck has a way of running out. So does patience, Mr. Crow," Wesley said, speaking for the first time, his voice low and even but carrying a warning underneath it that made Crow's smile falter just slightly. "I would think careful on whose luck you are counting on running out next if I were you." Crow looked at Wesley for a long moment, taking his measure the way a man takes the measure of an unexpected obstacle, and then he turned without another word and walked back toward the saloon, and Lucy felt the tension go out of her shoulders only once his black-suited figure had disappeared through the swinging doors. "He will not stop," she said quietly. "Men like that never stop until somebody makes them." "Then we will make him stop," Wesley said. "Together, if you will have me stay on." "I do not want you to stay on as a hired hand, Wesley," Lucy said, turning to face him fully there on the dusty street, careless of who might be watching from the store windows or the saloon porch. "I want you to stay as something else entirely if you will have that instead." Wesley Wilcox took off his hat, an old-fashioned courtesy that made something in Lucy's chest ache with tenderness, and he held it against his heart as he spoke. "Lucy Hadley," he said, "I have been drifting from one outfit to another since I was 14 years old, never staying anywhere long enough to be missed when I left, on account of I never believed there was any place in this world that was truly mine to stay in. But I have not felt that way once since I rode into this valley. I do not want to be your hired hand. I want to be your husband if you will have a man with no family, no money beyond his saddle and his horse, and no name that means anything to anyone but himself." "Your name means everything to me," Lucy said, her voice breaking on the words. "It always will." They were married on the 2nd Sunday of December, 1874, in the small white church in Prairie Bend, with both of the old hired men standing witness and the storekeeper's wife weeping openly through the entire brief ceremony. And afterward the whole town, it seemed, came out to Singing Creek Ranch for a wedding supper that stretched long into the winter evening, tables set up in the barn with lanterns strung along the rafters, fiddle music drifting out across the frosted pasture, where the cattle stood watching with mild, incurious eyes. It was not a grand wedding, not by the standards of the fine houses back east, but it was a wedding built entirely of people who had chosen to be there out of genuine affection rather than obligation, and Lucy, standing in her borrowed white dress with Wesley's hand warm around hers, thought that she had never in her whole life felt so thoroughly, unmistakably claimed. The years that followed were not easy ones, for ranching in that country never truly was, but they were good years, built brick by brick, or rather fence post by fence post, into something lasting. Wesley proved himself not only a fine hand with cattle and horses, but a shrewd manager of land and money besides. And together, he and Lucy expanded Singing Creek Ranch steadily through the latter half of the 1870s, buying up failing homesteads at fair prices when their neighbors could no longer hold on, always careful, unlike Crow, to deal honestly and generously with families in hard times. So that Singing Creek Ranch became known through the valley not merely as the largest outfit, but as the fairest one, the one a struggling family could sell to without shame and without being cheated. Jedediah Crow did not disappear from their lives easily, and the trouble between them came to its final crisis in the autumn of 1878, when a hard freeze came early and killed the winter feed across half the valley. And Crow, sensing weakness in every smaller outfit around him, moved to call in notes and force sales at a fraction of fair value, using his position on the county land board to delay filings and manipulate water rights against anyone who resisted him. He set his sights, in that hungry season, on the Alvarez family, homesteaders who ran a modest herd on land bordering Singing Creek to the south, a widow named Rosa Alvarez and her 3 children who had fallen behind on a note held, as it happened, by a bank in which Crow himself held a controlling interest. Lucy heard of it from Wesley, who had ridden to the Alvarez place to help repair a windmill and returned with his jaw set tight with anger. "Crow means to foreclose before the month is out," Wesley said. "Rosa Alvarez has 3 children and a note she cannot possibly pay with her herd half frozen and her hay gone. Crow is offering to buy the note from the bank himself, cheap, so he can take the land outright." "Then we buy the note first," Lucy said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." They rode into Prairie Bend the next morning, and Lucy walked into the bank, and with the confident bearing of a woman who now controlled the largest and most prosperous ranch in the valley, offered to purchase the Alvarez note outright at its full value, in cash, before Crow's own offer could be finalized. The banker, who had watched Lucy Hadley grow from an unclaimed orphan into the valley's most successful rancher, and who had no particular love for Jedediah Crow's manipulations besides, agreed readily, and Lucy rode out to the Alvarez homestead that same afternoon and told Rosa Alvarez, in front of her 3 frightened children, that her note now belonged to Singing Creek Ranch, and that she would have as long as she needed to repay it, in whatever way suited her family's circumstances. Rosa Alvarez wept and thanked her in Spanish and broken English both, and her eldest son, a boy of perhaps 12, looked at Lucy with an expression of such profound relief that Lucy felt, for the first time, the true weight and privilege of the position she had built for herself, not merely wealth or land, but the power to stand between a family and ruin, the very power that had never once been extended to her when she had been a friendless child in the Prairie Bend asylum. Jedediah Crow, furious at being outmaneuvered, confronted Lucy and Wesley outside the land office 2 days later, his careful composure finally cracking into open venom. "You think you have won something," he snarled, playing the generous lady of the valley. "You are still nothing but an orphan nobody wanted, dressing herself up in another family's land." The words might once have cut Lucy deeply, might have reopened every old wound from the asylum yard where families had walked past her without a second glance. But she found, standing there in the cold autumn sunlight with Wesley's steady presence beside her, and a valley full of neighbors who had come to depend on her fairness, that Crow's cruelty had lost its power over her entirely. "You are right that nobody claimed me, Mr. Crow," Lucy said, her voice calm and clear enough that several passers-by on the street slowed to listen. "Nobody came for me at that trading post, and nobody came for me at that asylum, and I spent a good many years believing that meant something was wrong with me, something unworthy of being wanted. But I have come to understand it different now. It was not that I was unworthy. It was that the people who should have claimed me simply failed to do their duty by me. That failure was theirs, not mine. And I have spent every year since building something so solid, so honest, and so useful to the people around me that nobody in this valley could ever again mistake my worth for something small. I own the largest ranch in this valley, Mr. Crow, not because anybody gave it to me, but because I built it, plank by plank and acre by acre, alongside a man who chose me freely, the same way I chose him. You cannot shame a person with the truth of their own hard beginning, not when they have made that beginning into something to be proud of." Crow had no answer for that, and within 2 years his own overextended holdings, weakened by his ruthless practices finally catching up to him in the form of angry creditors and neighbors unwilling to do business with him any longer, collapsed entirely, and he left the valley for good in 1880, never to be heard from again in that country. By that time, Singing Creek Ranch had grown to encompass nearly 40,000 acres, the largest single holding in the valley, its cattle prized at every stockyard from Cheyenne to Denver for their quality and condition, and its owners, Lucy and Wesley Wilcox, respected throughout the territory not merely for their wealth, but for the fairness and generosity with which they had built it. Lucy never forgot what it had cost her to be overlooked as a child, and she made certain, in every dealing with struggling neighbors, that no family in that valley would ever again be pushed off their land simply because they lacked the power to defend it. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after the man who had first seen worth in Lucy when no one else had bothered to look, was born in the spring of 1876, a sturdy, dark-haired boy who grew up practically living in the saddle, following his father across the range almost before he could properly walk. Their second child, a daughter they named Abigail after the woman who had taught Lucy her letters and fed her until her cheeks filled out with more than survival, arrived 2 years later, and she grew into a girl every bit as quiet and watchful as her mother had been, with a gift for gentling horses that rivaled even her father's. A third child followed in 1881, another son, whom they named Otis, after the peddler who had carried Lucy in from the cold so many years before, a small tribute to the first stranger who had at least troubled himself to notice her at all. Lucy Hadley Wilcox lived to see her ranch become not merely the largest in the valley, but a kind of legend told to every new family that settled in that stretch of Wyoming Territory. The story of the orphan girl nobody claimed who had built, through sheer stubborn will and an unshakable sense of fairness, the finest cattle operation for 100 miles in any direction. She lived to see the valley's population grow into a proper county, to see the railroad finally reach Prairie Bend in 1885, bringing with it new opportunities for the cattle trade that made Singing Creek Ranch more prosperous still. And she lived to see her own children grow, marry, and raise children of their own on land that would never again be threatened by a man like Jedediah Crow, because Lucy and Wesley had made certain, through careful legal work with an honest lawyer in Cheyenne, that the ranch and its water rights were secured beyond any possibility of the kind of trickery that had once nearly cost her everything. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was finished and the cattle stood settled in the home pasture under a sky turning gold and then violet over the Wind River Mountains, Lucy and Wesley would often walk together up the low hill above Singing Creek to the cottonwood tree under which Thomas and Abigail Doyle were buried, and they would stand there in the deepening light, her hand in his, and remember together how far they had both come from two friendless, unclaimed children who had once believed themselves unworthy of being wanted by anyone at all. "Do you ever wonder," Lucy asked him once, many years into their marriage, when their hair had begun to show streaks of gray and their children were grown enough to run the day-to-day work of the ranch themselves, "what might have become of us if you had ridden through this valley on some other road and never stopped at that livery stable?" Wesley considered the question with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything, his eyes on the darkening ridgeline where their cattle grazed the last of the evening light. "I do not believe there was ever another road for me, Lucy," he said finally. "I believe I was always riding toward you, whether I knew it at the time or not. A man who has spent his whole life being left behind learns, eventually, to recognize the one place and the one person worth staying for. I recognized it the moment I saw you standing outside that livery stable, asking me straight out if I was looking for work, not a hint of pity or condescension in your voice, only a woman doing what needed doing. I had never in my life met anyone like that before. Nobody claimed either one of us. Once," Lucy said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared over the mountains. "But we claimed each other, and we claimed this valley besides, and I would not trade that hard beginning for an easier one, not if it meant losing what came after. "Nor would I," Wesley said, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head, there on the hill above the creek that had first given her a name, however borrowed, and a home, however unlikely, and a love that neither of them had ever believed, as children, they would be permitted to have. They grew old together on that land, watching Singing Creek Ranch pass eventually into the capable hands of their eldest son Thomas, who ran it with the same fairness his parents had always insisted upon, and watching their daughter Abigail marry a good, steady rancher from the northern end of the valley, and watching their youngest son Otis take up the study of law in Cheyenne, determined, he said, to make certain no child in the territory would ever again be as vulnerable as his own mother had once been. With no one to speak for her rights before a court or a land office. The town of Prairie Bend grew into a proper city in the years that followed, and long after Lucy and Wesley Wilcox had passed, quietly and together within the same winter. In the year 1911, their names remained spoken with respect throughout that stretch of Wyoming, the story told and retold at church socials and county fairs, of the orphan girl nobody claimed, who had built, out of nothing but stubbornness and an unbreakable sense of what was right, the finest ranch the valley had ever known, and who had found, in a quiet drifting cowboy with a scar over one eyebrow and eyes like strong coffee, the one soul in all the wide territory who had looked at her not with pity, and not with calculation, but simply with the plain, steady recognition of someone finally, truly seen. And on the hill above Singing Creek, under the old cottonwood tree, 4 graves stood together at last, Thomas and Abigail Doyle, who had first claimed an unwanted child as their own, and Lucy and Wesley Wilcox, who had claimed each other and built, from 2 broken beginnings, a legacy that would outlast them both by generations, a ranch, a family, and a love story that the whole valley remembered as proof that no one, however overlooked in their beginning, is ever truly beyond the reach of being claimed at last by the right and steady hand.